The forest breathed with secrets, heavy with the scent of wet moss and ancient pine, a wild perfection that made something in my chest tighten with longing. I steadied myself against the weathered trunk of a towering oak, my fingers pressing into the rough bark as distant sounds drifted through the dense canopy behind me. Music, laughter, the rhythmic pulse of ceremonial drums that had been echoing since the sun dipped below the horizon, the bonding ceremony. Everyone who held any significance was gathered there, dressed in their most elegant attire, each hoping to capture the attention of someone influential, someone who could raise their standing within the pack hierarchy. Everyone except me. My hair, the color of pale moonlight, caught the final golden rays filtering through the leaves above. I tucked a loose strand behind my ear with trembling fingers, soil still visible beneath my nails from clawing through the collapsed entrance of the small cave. My dress, the only presentable, one I owned, was torn along the bottom edge, stained with mud and fragments of green moss. I had invested hours preparing it, carefully mending the frayed seams by flickering candlelight, imagining how I might slip into the crowd unnoticed, present but invisible, acceptable if not acknowledged. None of those careful preparations mattered now. The elderly woman's hand felt cold and fragile in mine, her breathing shallow and uneven, each breath a struggle. I had discovered her 3 hours earlier, wandering confused and disoriented near the border territories, mumbling incoherently about her granddaughter who lived in the eastern settlements, about a fall, about an ankle twisted beyond use, confusion settling over her mind as shock tightened its grip. When the rain had started, she had sought shelter in a shallow cave, but the entrance had partially collapsed, trapping her leg beneath heavy stones and broken timber. "You should leave, child," she whispered, her weathered face pale gray in the fading twilight. "Your ceremony is waiting." "Shh," I murmured softly, pulling my cloak tighter around her trembling shoulders. "The ceremony isn't important." But it was important. Of course it was. I was 23 years old, considered ancient by pack standards to still be unmated, unclaimed, unattached to anyone of any significance whatsoever. My parents had died when I was 14, leaving me with nothing except a tiny cottage positioned at the very edge of packlands and a reputation for being far too quiet, far too peculiar, far too unsuitable for the rigid hierarchy that governed every aspect of our existence. I didn't possess the natural confidence of the high-born females, didn't have the practiced charm of those raised in prominent families with connections and influence. I simply existed somewhere in the margins, tolerated but never truly embraced. The bonding ceremony was supposed to represent my opportunity, not to discover love. I wasn't foolish enough to harbor those hopes, but to find security, a position, someone who might consider me useful enough to keep nearby. Instead, I was here in the darkening wilderness with a woman whose name remained unknown to me. I sent word, I told her, though I wasn't certain she could hear me anymore. "The healers know our location. They will come soon." I had sprinted back to the village borders an hour ago, located a young patrol guard, and desperately pleaded with him to summon help. He had stared at me as though I had lost my mind, covered head to toe in dirt, frantic and wild-eyed, babbling about an injured elder deep in the woods, while the most significant social event of the entire year continued without interruption. But something in my expression must have reached him, because he had nodded slowly and vanished in the direction of the healer's lodge. That was an hour ago, perhaps longer. Time felt distorted out here, measured only by the woman's increasingly labored breathing and the way the temperature plummeted as true darkness approached. I hummed quietly, an old melody I could barely remember, something my mother used to sing when I was small and frightened. The woman's fingers twitched weakly in mine, and I hoped desperately that it brought her even a small measure of comfort. The drums maintained their distant rhythm, a persistent heartbeat that reminded me of everything I was sacrificing, of everyone who would notice my absence and draw their own cruel conclusions. She couldn't even manage to appear, probably fortunate for everyone. Who would possibly want someone like her anyway? The thoughts weren't my own, but I could hear them as clearly as if they had been spoken directly into my ear. Years of existing on the periphery taught you to anticipate rejection before it ever arrived, to brace yourself against the inevitable disappointment. A branch snapped sharply somewhere behind me. Every muscle in my body went rigid, every instinct suddenly screaming warnings of danger. Approaching fast. The patrol should be coming from the east from the direction of the village center. This sound originated from the west, from deeper within the forest, from territories we had been explicitly warned to avoid at all costs. Who's out there? My voice emerged stronger than I felt, though my heart hammered violently against my ribs, threatening to break through. Silence answered me. Then footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, crushing through the underbrush with purpose. 3 figures materialized from the shadows between the towering trees, men, tall and powerfully constructed, moving with the controlled precision of experienced warriors. They weren't from our pack. I understood that immediately from their unfamiliar presence, from the way they carried themselves with absolute authority, even on foreign territory. The one positioned in the center stopped approximately 12 feet away, his eyes methodically scanning the scene with calculated assessment. Dark hair, sharp, angular features, an air of command so tangible it seemed to make the very air feel heavier and more oppressive. His gaze traveled from the collapsed cave entrance to the unconscious woman to me, kneeling in the dirt with my ruined dress and tangled hair. "You're trespassing on Crescent Moon territory," I said, forcing my voice to maintain steadiness despite the fear coursing through my veins. "The border is half a mile west of here. We're perfectly aware." His voice was deep and controlled, completely unbothered by my feeble attempt at authority. We heard someone calling for help in distress. My mind raced frantically. I hadn't called out for help, had I? Perhaps when I had been struggling to move the larger stones, perhaps I had made more noise than I had realized in my desperation. Or maybe the elderly woman had cried out before I had found her collapsed and confused. "The healers are already coming," I said firmly, shifting my position slightly to place myself more completely between these strangers and the injured woman. "We don't require assistance from wolves who clearly know what they're doing." The man positioned to the right spoke up, younger than their leader with bronze-toned skin and a hint of amusement coloring his tone. "No offense intended, but you appear to have been losing a battle with that cave for several hours now." He wasn't wrong about that. My hands were scraped completely raw, my arms trembling visibly from sheer exhaustion. I had managed to free her trapped leg, but attempting to move an unconscious woman alone would risk causing far worse injuries than she already had. The leader studied me with unsettling intensity, his expression completely unreadable. "How long has she been unconscious like this?" 20 minutes, maybe slightly less. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "Who are you exactly? Does it really matter?" He moved forward with fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural, and I noticed immediately that the others automatically assumed positions on either side of him, protective and strategic in their placement. "She requires proper shelter and medical treatment very soon, or hypothermia will begin setting in." Everything inside me screamed not to trust them. Unknown wolves appearing on our territory far too conveniently, moving with military precision that spoke of extensive training. But the elderly woman's breathing was deteriorating with each passing minute. The forest was growing colder as night settled in completely, and the healers still hadn't arrived despite my desperate message. The leader crouched beside me, close enough that I could see amber flecks dancing in his dark eyes, sparking with intelligence and something else I couldn't identify. "I'm going to examine her injuries carefully. You can either assist me or move out of my way entirely." There was no threat present in his voice, only absolute certainty that he would proceed with this, regardless of my opinion on the matter, and beneath my fear, beneath every instinct that screamed warnings about protocol and borders and unknown dangers, I recognized something strangely familiar in his tone. The sound of someone who had spent far too many nights alone, making difficult decisions in the darkness with no good options available. I nodded once, sharp and decisive, making my choice. Her leg is badly injured, possibly fractured. She struck her head when she fell. She's been disoriented and confused since I discovered her here. His hands moved over the woman with practiced efficiency, either a healer's experienced touch or at minimum a warrior extensively trained in field medicine and emergency care. The younger wolf produced a metal flask from somewhere, and working together the three of them fashioned a makeshift stretcher from their traveling cloaks with impressive speed that spoke of considerable experience in crisis situations. "Where do you need her transported?" the leader asked, glancing up at me with those penetrating eyes. "The healer's lodge on the eastern side of the village." I stopped abruptly, realization hitting me with the force of ice water. "You can't enter there. You're not pack members. The guards won't permit you to pass the borders without proper authorization from someone who actually bothered to show up tonight." His expression remained completely neutral, but something flickered briefly in his eyes. Disappointment, perhaps, or judgment of the situation. "We'll transport her to your border then. Your healers can meet us at that location." He stood smoothly, and I found myself rising with him, drawn upward by the sheer force of his commanding presence. This close, I could observe the faint scars tracing along his jawline, the weight of authority that rested on his broad shoulders like a visible mantle of leadership. "Thank you," I said quietly, meaning it with everything in me, "for helping her when you didn't have to." "Don't thank me yet." He turned to his companions, issuing quick, quiet commands I couldn't quite hear clearly. Then back to me, his gaze holding mine with uncomfortable directness that made me feel exposed. "What's your name? Does it matter?" I echoed his earlier words back to him, attempting defiance but achieving only bone-deep exhaustion. The corner of his mouth twitched slightly, not quite forming a smile but approaching close. "I suppose it doesn't matter right now." They lifted the woman with careful precision, treating her as though she were made of fragile glass, and I followed closely as they began moving through the forest toward our territorial border. The younger wolf maintained a steady stream of quiet observations, pointing out obstacles in the darkness, adjusting their collective pace accordingly. The third man remained completely silent, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness surrounding us for potential threats. I should have been terrified. I was completely alone with three strange males, following them deeper into the woods while the ceremony continued without me, while my one chance at changing my circumstances slipped away forever. But fear had gradually given way to something entirely different, a strange sense of rightness, of purpose that I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in what felt like forever, I had made a choice that genuinely mattered, had helped someone desperately in need without calculating the social cost first, even though it meant sacrificing the one night that might have altered everything about my existence. We reached the border just as torches appeared flickering through the trees ahead. Finally, the healers had arrived, accompanied by guards whose expressions shifted instantly from concern to deep suspicion the precise moment they spotted the unfamiliar strangers carrying our pack member. "What's happening here?" The head guard, a grizzled veteran named Marcus, stepped forward aggressively with his hand resting on his weapon. "Who are these wolves, and why are they on our land?" "They helped me," I said quickly, desperately. The woman needed immediate assistance, and I couldn't move her safely alone. "We're leaving now." The leader's voice cut cleanly through the rising tension, calm and absolute in its authority. He and his companions lowered the stretcher with careful precision, allowing our healers to take over the woman's care completely. "Your territory. Your responsibility from this point forward." Marcus's eyes narrowed with suspicion and hostility. "You're from Silver Ridge Pack. We understand the strict protocols about crossing borders without prior authorization. We do understand them." The leader met Marcus's challenge with unwavering composure that suggested he feared nothing. "And we've just returned to our own side of the border. No harm has been done here." He was technically correct. During our walk, we had crossed back into Silver Ridge territory, a clever and strategic maneuver. The leader's gaze found mine one final time across the small clearing, illuminated by torchlight, and something profound passed between us. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or understanding that transcended words. Then he nodded once, the movement barely perceptible, and disappeared into the forest with his companions as silently as they had first appeared, like ghosts dissolving into shadow. "Are you completely insane?" Marcus rounded on me furiously the instant they had vanished from sight. "Do you have any idea whatsoever who that was?" My stomach dropped sickeningly. Who was he? But Marcus was already shaking his head in disbelief, gesturing urgently for the healers to hurry their work. "Return to the village immediately and pray to the ancestors that your absence tonight doesn't trigger the diplomatic incident. It probably will." I stood frozen in the torchlight, my ruined dress clinging uncomfortably to my legs, dirt embedded under my nails, exhaustion settling deep into my bones, watching the healers work efficiently on the unconscious woman who I had risked everything to save. The drums had finally stopped their insistent beating. The ceremony must have concluded, and I had missed it entirely, saving a stranger with unexpected help from wolves whose names I didn't know, from a pack whose reputation suddenly seemed far more significant than I had ever realized. The elderly woman stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open with returning consciousness. She looked directly at me, genuinely lucid for the first time in hours, and smiled with surprising warmth. "You have a kind heart, child," she whispered, her voice stronger now. "That quality will matter far more than you currently know or understand." Then the healers transported her away toward proper medical care, and I was left standing alone at the border between territories, between the life I had always known and something else entirely different, something that had begun with a choice made in darkness, and a stranger's amber eyes that had actually seen me when absolutely no one else had bothered to look. If you're enjoying this story, please don't forget to like and subscribe for more captivating stories just like this one. I didn't sleep at all that night. The cottage felt oppressively empty, far too quiet after the chaos and intensity of the forest encounter. I sat positioned by the window as dawn gradually broke over the eastern hills, painting the sky in breathtaking shades of rose and gold, and tried desperately to make sense of what Marcus's ominous words had actually meant. "Do you have any idea who that was?" The question circled endlessly through my mind like a predatory bird, never landing, never offering any concrete answers or clarity. By the time full morning finally arrived, my eyes burned painfully with exhaustion, and my hands still ached deeply from moving those heavy stones for hours. I had scrubbed the dirt from beneath my nails until my fingers were raw, braided my pale hair into something vaguely resembling respectability, and changed into my everyday dress, simple gray linen that wouldn't attract any attention whatsoever. Not that anything I wore ever attracted attention anyway. The village was already fully awake and active when I stepped outside into the morning light. I could hear animated voices drifting from the main square, an unusual amount of activity and energy for the morning following a major ceremony. Typically, the day after such significant events was quiet and subdued, as newly bonded couples retreated to celebrate privately, and those who had failed to make connections nursed their disappointments in solitude and shame. This felt distinctly different, urgent and charged with tension. I made my way toward the healer's lodge first, following the familiar path past cottages that grew progressively larger and significantly better, maintained the closer they were positioned to the pack center, where the influential families resided. A few people glanced at me as I passed, some with open curiosity, others with barely concealed disdain that I had grown accustomed to over the years. Especially, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss these amazing stories. Sophia, a she-wolf approximately my age who had been aggressively pursuing the beta's son for months, actually smirked with malicious satisfaction when she saw me. "Heard you had quite the adventure last night," she said, her tone absolutely dripping with false sympathy designed to wound. "Such a shame you missed absolutely everything important." Nathan bonded with Jessica. It was a beautiful ceremony, truly magical. The words were carefully designed to cause pain, and they succeeded perfectly. Nathan had shown me genuine kindness once, years ago during a difficult time. I had been foolish enough to mistake that simple kindness for romantic interest, a mistake that had cost me dearly. "I'm glad for them both," I said quietly, moving past her quickly before she could observe the flush creeping up my neck, before she could see how much her words actually affected me. The healer's lodge sat positioned at the edge of the central compound, a long, low building constructed of stone that perpetually smelled of medicinal herbs and burning wood. I found Elena, the head healer, grinding something aromatic in a worn mortar, her silver-streaked hair tied back in a severely practical bun that had probably looked identical for decades. "The woman from last night," I said, without any preamble or polite introduction. "Is she going to survive?" "She's alive thanks entirely to you." Elena looked up from her work, her sharp eyes assessing me with the same clinical precision she applied to evaluating every patient who came through her doors. "Broken leg, mild concussion, severe dehydration, but she'll make a complete recovery. Her family has been notified and they're traveling here now." Relief flooded through my entire body, loosening muscles I hadn't even realized were tensed painfully tight. "Can I see her?" "She's sleeping, peacefully, but she specifically asked about you before the sedative took full effect." Elena set down her mortar carefully, wiping her stained hands on her herb-covered apron. She told me to tell the girl with light hair that she was deeply grateful for everything. Something warm bloomed unexpectedly in my chest, small and fragile, but undeniably real. Gratitude, recognition, acknowledgement that I had mattered to someone. It shouldn't have affected me so profoundly, but it did. "There's something else you should know," Elena continued, her expression growing considerably more serious. "The Alpha wants to see you immediately." My blood turned instantly to ice. "What? Why would he want to see me? I imagine it has everything to do with the 3 Silver Ridge wolves who carried an injured pack member across our borders last night without authorization." She raised an eyebrow knowingly. "Marcus reported the entire incident. Protocol absolutely demands a thorough investigation." Of course it did. I had been so intensely focused on the woman's survival, so consumed with keeping her alive, that I hadn't properly considered the political implications of what had transpired. Our packs weren't exactly enemies, but we certainly weren't allies either. The borders existed for legitimate reasons. Territorial disputes stretching back generations, old grievances that nobody quite remembered the origins of, but everyone still honored religiously. When? My voice came out considerably smaller than I had intended. Now would be advisable. Don't keep him waiting. The walk to the Alpha's residence felt like a condemned prisoner's journey to execution. The building stood imposingly at the village's heart, significantly larger than any other structure, built from stone and timber that had weathered decades of harsh mountain storms without yielding. Guards flanked the entrance, their expressions carefully neutral as I approached on trembling legs. Inside, the air smelled overwhelmingly of leather and pine, masculine and imposing in every detail. I had been inside only twice before in my entire life. Once as a small child with my parents when they were still alive, once to receive official notification of their deaths. Neither visit had been remotely pleasant. Alpha Richard sat behind a massive oak desk that seemed designed to intimidate. His gray-shot hair and deeply lined face provided clear testament to 40 years of demanding leadership. Beside him stood his son, Daniel, who would inherit the alpha position within the year according to pack tradition. They both looked up simultaneously as I entered, and I dropped my eyes immediately, instinct demanding complete submission to authority. "You're the one who found the elder last night," Richard's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Margaret Stone." "Yes, Alpha," I kept my gaze fixed firmly on the floor, not daring to meet his eyes. "Look at me, girl. Now." I obeyed reluctantly, forcing myself to meet his penetrating eyes despite every nerve screaming to show proper deference and submission. His expression was completely unreadable, not overtly angry, but certainly not pleased either. "Marcus says 3 Silver Ridge wolves helped transport her back. Says you interacted with them directly and extensively." He leaned forward intently. "Describe them to me in detail." I recounted everything I could possibly remember about the encounter, their physical appearances, their impressive efficiency, the way they had moved with obvious military precision and extensive training. Richard listened without interrupting once, but I noticed Daniel's expression shifting gradually from bored indifference to sharp, focused attention. "The leader," Daniel said quietly, almost to himself. Dark hair, amber eyes, visible scars on his jaw. "That's correct," I confirmed, confused about why these details mattered so much. Father and son exchanged a loaded look I couldn't begin to interpret. "Do you know who that was?" Richard asked, echoing Marcus's question from the previous night. "No, Alpha, should I?" Another weighted silence filled the room. Then Daniel actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that held no humor. "She genuinely doesn't know." "Doesn't know what exactly?" Frustration crept into my voice, despite my better judgment about challenging authority. Richard stood slowly, moving to the large window that overlooked the busy village square below. That was Alexander Stone, Alpha King of Silver Ridge, the single most powerful wolf in the entire Northern Territories. The room tilted violently. I gripped the back of a nearby chair to steady myself, my mind absolutely refusing to process this impossible information. The stranger who had knelt in the dirt beside me without hesitation, who had helped without asking for anything in return, who had looked at me like I was an actual person rather than an inconvenience to be dismissed. That was an Alpha King. "That's absolutely impossible," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "He wouldn't. Why would he ever? Why would an Alpha King be wandering our borders alone?" Richard turned back to face me directly. "That's precisely what I intend to discover. Silver Ridge sent official word this morning. Alexander Stone is coming here today to visit our pack. Officially." My legs went weak. "Here? Today? Why?" "He claims he's coming to personally ensure the injured woman receives proper care and recovers fully." Daniel's eyes narrowed with obvious suspicion. "But Alpha Kings absolutely don't make personal visits for simple welfare checks. There's definitely something else happening here." "What does any of this have to do with me?" I asked desperately. "Everything, apparently." Richard returned to his desk, pulling out a formal letter sealed with distinctive silver wax. "He specifically requested your presence at the meeting. By name." "But he didn't know my name," I protested weakly. "I never told him." We parted at the border without exchanging that basic information, and I had assumed, had desperately hoped, that would be the absolute end of our interaction. "I don't understand any of this." "Neither do we." Richard's expression hardened noticeably. "Which is precisely why you'll be present when he arrives. You'll answer his questions with complete honesty and you'll do absolutely nothing whatsoever to create a diplomatic incident. Is that completely clear? Yes, Alpha. Dismissed. Be back here within the hour. Don't be late. I fled the residence on trembling legs, my mind racing frantically with possibilities. An Alpha King. I had spoken to him like he was just another ordinary wolf, had actually challenged him about crossing borders, had looked directly into his eyes without showing proper submission. Any single one of those actions could be considered deeply disrespectful. Together, they could potentially be seen as an insult worthy of severe punishment. And now he was coming here, asking specifically for me, and I had absolutely no idea why. The village square had transformed dramatically in the short time I had been inside. Word must have spread rapidly about the impending royal visit because people were everywhere, frantically cleaning, organizing with military precision, preparing for an inspection that would determine how Silver Ridge viewed our entire pack going forward. I spotted Sophia near the fountain, dressed in her absolute finest clothing, clearly hoping desperately to be noticed by someone important. Did you hear the news? She appeared beside me suddenly like a scavenging bird. The Alpha King himself is actually coming here. Someone said it's directly because of what happened last night with you. Her smile was absolutely poisonous. Must be nice, finally getting attention from someone important, even if it's only because you caused a potentially serious border incident. I walked away without responding to her obvious bait, but her cruel words burrowed deeply under my skin anyway. Was that what everyone thought? That I had deliberately created this situation specifically to gain notice and attention? The hour passed in an absolute blur of mounting anxiety. I returned to my cottage, changed into my only other decent dress, deep blue linen that my mother had made years ago with her own hands, and tried desperately to calm my racing heart. Nothing about this situation made any logical sense whatsoever. Alpha Kings had extensive advisors, professional messengers, entire diplomatic corps specifically designed to handle situations exactly like this. They didn't make personal visits to investigate minor border crossings, unless it wasn't actually minor, unless there was something critically important I had missed, some significance to our encounter that I couldn't see or understand. When I returned to the Alpha's residence at the appointed time, the square was absolutely packed with curious onlookers. Richard stood at the entrance with Daniel and several high-ranking pack members, all dressed formally, all projecting a carefully crafted image of strength and stability for the visiting royalty. I was directed to stand slightly behind and to the left, present but not prominent, visible but not important. The exact position of someone who didn't quite belong anywhere. Horns sounded ceremonially from the eastern road. 3 horses crested the hill, moving at an easy canter, their riders commanding immediate attention without any effort whatsoever. I recognized them instantly. The 3 wolves from the forest, now dressed in formal traveling clothes that marked them unmistakably as nobility. The younger one I had noticed before rode on the left, grinning like he found this entire situation genuinely amusing. The silent one maintained his protective position on the right, his eyes constantly scanning for potential threats. And in the center, sitting astride a magnificent black stallion with the easy grace of someone born to absolute command, was Alexander Stone. He looked significantly different in bright daylight, more dangerous somehow. The scars I had barely noticed last night stood out in sharp relief against his tanned skin. His dark hair was pulled back, revealing the strong, angular lines of his face, the sharp intelligence burning in those penetrating amber eyes. He wore black leather and silver, the official colors of Silver Ridge, and carried himself with an authority that made Richard's considerable power look diminished by comparison. This was an Alpha King in his full power, and I had spent last night casually arguing with him while kneeling in dirt. The horses stopped. Alexander dismounted in one fluid motion that demonstrated years of practice, his companions following his lead immediately. Richard stepped forward, the formal greeting already prepared on his lips. But Alexander's gaze swept past him, past Daniel, past all the carefully arranged pack members, and landed directly on me with laser focus. For one endless moment, those amber eyes held mine, with an intensity that completely stole my breath. Then, impossibly, he smiled. Not the polite, diplomatic smile of a visiting dignitary, but something genuine, something warm, something that made every single wolf in the square turn to stare at me, with expressions ranging from utter confusion to barely concealed envy. "Hello again," Alexander said, his voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence. "I believe we have unfinished business to discuss." And with those simple words, everything I thought I understood about my small, invisible existence shattered completely like fragile glass. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss when I post these incredible stories.